Hello, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick around. Now, I went to watch the new Michael Jackson movie in the cinema, which, if you haven't seen it, please do. It's absolutely incredible. But anyway, part of the movie focuses on an interaction that he had with MTV. Now, I'll get into the weeds of that later in this episode because there's a lot to unpack there, let's just say. But it got me thinking in general about the history of MTV. See, MTV wasn't just a TV channel. It completely transformed the way that we experience music psychologically, culturally, and emotionally. Honestly, music channels in general. I used to spend hours after school just watching music channels, and honestly, I miss those days. And really, it's difficult to overstate just how revolutionary MTV was at the time. So, on August 1st, 1981, MTV launched with the song Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles. And that choice was really symbolic because in many ways, the music industry was really shifting. Before MTV, most people experienced artists mainly through their voices. You might know what someone sounded like long before you knew what they looked like. And songs lived largely in your imagination. The emotional worlds attached to the music were often created internally by the listener. But MTV really changed that. Suddenly, music became this visual thing. Artists didn't just need a good voice anymore. They needed an image, a personality, a recognizable aesthetic, choreography, and storytelling. Music videos transform songs into cinematic experiences and transform musicians into fully visual celebrities because when music becomes visual, it changes the way that our brains actually process it. So in today's episode, I want to dive into not just the history of MTV or music videos, but how music videos fundamentally change the psychology of music itself. I'm so excited for this one, so let's get into it. So music videos didn't actually begin with MTV. MTV may have popularized the format globally, but the idea of combining music with moving images had already existed for decades. In many ways, humans have always wanted music to be visual. I think about, even before modern technology, there were concerts, opera, theatre, dance, and rituals that all combined sound with visual storytelling. Honestly, we're naturally multisensory creatures. Our brains are constantly trying to connect what we hear with what we see. And long before the term music video even existed, people were already experimenting with exactly that. See, back in the 1920s through to the 40s, there was something called soundies. Now, these were short musical films that people could watch on visual jukebox machines called panorams, and these were in bars, cafes, and public venues across America. Think of them almost as like an early ancestor of MTV or YouTube, short-form music content designed for quick visual entertainment. And the clips often featured jazz musicians, dancers, singers, and live performances. And while technologically primitive by today's standards, psychologically they represented something really important, which was that music was beginning to move beyond purely audio consumption. People weren't just hearing songs anymore, they were watching performance, movement, fashion, charisma, and facial expressions. Even then, visuals were starting to shape emotional interpretation and artist identity. And research today actually supports why that matters at its core. See, studies in music psychology suggest that visual information can significantly influence the way that we perceive music emotionally. Our brains don't process sound in isolation. We naturally integrate visual cues like body language, facial expressions, movement, and aesthetics all into our emotional understanding of music. So, in other words, the visual side of music isn't just decoration, it actively changes perception. And you can really see the beginnings of that during the 60s. By this point, television was becoming increasingly central to pop culture, and artists were starting to realize that visual presentation could massively amplify their music and public image. One of the most important examples of this was the Beatles. During the mid-60s, the Beatles began creating these promotional film clips for songs like Paperback Writer and Rain. Now, technically, these clips were created for practical reasons. See, the Beatles had become so globally famous that constantly traveling for television appearances was becoming exhausting and logistically impossible. There wasn't the technology back then that we had now, okay? Travel was not that easy. So instead of appearing live on every program around the world, they could send these film performances instead, which is genius, right? But creatively, something much bigger was happening. These clips weren't just simply recordings of performances. They started experimenting with editing, humor, camera angles, symbolism, and, of course, aesthetic presentation. The artist was no longer just performing the music. They were trying to construct this whole visual identity around it. And this was really important because once visuals enter the equation, songs stop existing purely in the imagination of the listener. See, before visual media dominated music culture, hearing a song was often this deeply internal experience. Listeners imagined scenes, emotions, and meanings for themselves. Music could really feel intensely personal because the imagery belonged entirely to you. But once the artists began attaching official visuals to songs, they started guiding interpretation more directly. The audience was no longer just hearing the music, they were being shown how to experience it in a way. And by the 70s, this idea became even more sophisticated. One of the most important turning points came with Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. Now, today, many people consider the Bohemian Rhapsody video to be one of the clearest blueprints for the modern music video. What made it revolutionary wasn't just the fact that it existed, it was how cinematic it felt. The video used this stylized editing, dramatic lighting, layered visual effects, and this really strong visual branding from this surreal imagery. It transformed the song into an experience. And around this time, music videos were evolving from this simple documentation into this kind of storytelling. Artists were beginning to understand that visuals could deepen emotion, strengthen memory, and create this kind of mythology around songs as well. The disco era especially embraced this visual spectacle. Music became increasingly connected to fashion and glamour, lighting, dance, and performance, and just this element of theatre. Artists weren't just selling records anymore, they were selling worlds and lifestyles. But television itself also played a huge role in this transition. Before MTV came around, shows like Top of the Pops in the UK and Countdown in Australia helped make televised music performances a central part of youth culture. Audiences were becoming used to not only hearing songs, but visually associating them with artists, personalities, and performance styles. And then there was Video Concert Hall, one of the earliest television programs dedicated almost entirely to airing music videos before MTV even existed. So by the late 1970s, let's just say the groundwork had already been laid. Music was becoming less abstract and increasingly visual. Songs were no longer floating freely in listeners' imaginations in quite the same way. Instead, they were becoming attached to faces and aesthetics, these narratives and identities. And then, in 1981, MTV arrived and accelerated that transformation on a global scale. MTV, or music television, launched as the world's first 24-hour music video channel. And honestly, it's really difficult to fully explain just how revolutionary that concept was at the time. See, today we live in a world of constant content, right? We're used to endless video streams on YouTube, personalized algorithms on TikTok and Instagram, and being visually overstimulated almost every second of the day. But in 1981, the idea of a television channel dedicated entirely to music videos felt futuristic. MTV wasn't simply a new entertainment channel. It represented a major cultural shift in the way that music itself would be consumed. See, for decades, radio had been the dominant way that people experienced music. Songs were primarily auditory experiences, like I said, but MTV signaled the beginning of a new era where visuals would become inseparable from sound. And that's why it's so fascinating that MTV launched with Video Killed the Radio Star, because the song itself is essentially about technological change and nostalgia. It captures the anxiety that often comes with new forms of media replacing older ones. The lyrics mourn an earlier era while simultaneously embracing the future. And honestly, every generation seems to go through some version of this fear. People worried that television would replace radio, and then worried that the internet would replace television, and then worried streaming would destroy physical music culture. And now people debate whether short-form content is fundamentally changing creativity and attention spans. It's something that we're constantly going through. But what's interesting is that these media shifts don't just change technology, they do change culture. See, with every major evolution in media reshapes the way that people engage with art, communicate identity, and participate in collective experiences. Radio created one kind of music culture. MTV created another. And today, platforms like YouTube and TikTok have created entirely new ones again. MTV encouraged longer form visual storytelling through these kind of cinematic music videos, while TikTok has shifted music consumption towards these hyper short visual moments, hooks, choreography, and virality. We can trace this progression historically. With each era, it changes not only how music is distributed, but how artists are discovered, how trends spread, and how audiences engage with songs socially. Also, attention spans, memory, emotional attachment, and identity formation. MTV accelerated the idea that music was no longer just something to hear in the background. It was becoming a visual and cultural experience. And once MTV arrived, artists suddenly had access to something unprecedented. A platform that could broadcast their image, style, and artistic world into people's homes 24 hours a day. Music was no longer confined to concerts, record stores, or the radio. It became part of television culture, youth culture, and everyday visual life. And that shift would completely transform what it meant to be a music artist in the modern world. So when people talk about MTV, it's easy to reduce it to nostalgia, neon graphics, iconic music videos, but MTV represented something so much bigger than that. It really marked the moment that music fully entered the visual age, and once that happened, there was no going back. But one angle that sits underneath all of this is that MTV wasn't just a cultural shift in music. It really was one of the first large-scale systems of attention engineering in music history, because once music entered this 24-hour visual environment, it wasn't only competing with other songs anymore, it was competing with everything else on TV. Adverts, films, news, entertainment, all within the same attention space. And in that context, music videos weren't just artistic extensions of songs. They became designed attention structures. Editing became faster. The visual hooks came in earlier. Color, movement, fashion, and narrative were all used to hold attention long enough for the music to land. Even if not explicitly framed that way at the time, the logic was shifting. It wasn't just how do we express this song visually, but it was also about how do we keep people watching. And this logic really is just evolving today. Coming back to platforms like TikTok, attention doesn't just influence success. Attention is the product. The system is built around retention, rewatching, and immediate emotional capture. So in that sense, TikTok isn't really a break from MTV's logic. It's basically an acceleration of it. Where MTV curated attention through programming and rotation, TikTok automates it through algorithms. So MTV can be seen as one of the first mass systems where music had to be designed not just to be heard or seen, but to be watched long enough to matter. Now, once MTV entered the picture, the role of the music artist began to fundamentally change. Like I said, artists were no longer just musicians or performers. They became these visual personalities. In many ways, MTV transformed artists into brands, characters, and just these entire aesthetic worlds. And you can really see this in the artists who came to define the MTV era. Madonna, for example, she wasn't just selling songs, she was selling reinvention, controversy, fashion, and identity. Prince as well, he built this entire world around mystery, sexuality, and visual symbolism, this element of theatre. Duran Duran curated glamorous cinematic videos inspired by fashion photography and film, helping establish the idea that pop music could feel aspirational and luxurious. Even bands like Queen, who emerged before MTV fully exploded, adapted incredibly well, of course, to the visual era because of their theatrical performance style and larger-than-life presentation. And what's super fascinating is that audiences were no longer just connecting to songs, they were connecting to personas. Because before MTV, fans might have loved an artist's voice, lyrics, or musical style. Of course, they saw them in interviews as well on occasion, but MTV introduced a much more immersive form of connection. Fans could now repeatedly watch artists move, dance, smile, perform, and interact with the camera in a different way. They learned facial expressions and body language, attitudes and mannerisms, and artists became psychologically familiar. Now, this connects strongly to the concept of parasocial relationships, which are essentially one-sided relationships, quite emotional ones, that audiences develop with media figures. Now, researchers Horton and Wohl first introduced the concept in the 50s when studying television personalities, but MTV really intensified parasocial attachment in a completely new way because music suddenly became visually intimate. With radio, artists often felt distant and abstract, but MTV brought them directly into people's bedrooms and living rooms every single day. And research shows that repeated visual exposure increases feelings of familiarity, emotional closeness, and perceived intimacy. So even though audiences had never actually met these artists, they could begin to feel as though they did know them personally. And this mattered because humans are naturally social imitators. So Albert Bandura's social learning theory suggests that people learn behaviors, attitudes, and identities through observing others, especially figures that they admire or perceive as successful, attractive, or aspirational in some way. And MTV effectively turned musicians into some of the most visible social models in the world. Young audiences weren't just listening to artists anymore, they were studying them. People copied clothing, dance styles, hairstyles, makeup, speech, confidence, even ways of moving through the world. The MTV era helped create the idea that music taste itself could function as identity expression. To align yourself with a certain artist often meant aligning yourself with a certain lifestyle or personality type. So fans of Madonna dress differently from fans of Prince. And fans of Duran Duran embrace different aesthetics and aspirations to, fans of heavy metal or punk acts. music became increasingly tied to these subcultures and images and self-presentation. And developmentally, this was especially powerful for teenagers and young adults who are in one of the most identity-sensitive stages of life. So, research in developmental psychology suggests that adolescence is a key period for experimenting with identity, social belonging, and self-concept. Music has always played a role in that process, but MTV just really amplified it by giving these audiences visual blueprints for who they could become. So suddenly, music wasn't just emotional expression, it became this aspirational identity construction. And that fundamentally changed celebrity culture. Artists were no longer just judged on musical talent. There were all these other factors like visual charisma, fashion, attractiveness, and their performance style. All of these kind of marketable aesthetics became increasingly important. And in some ways, the foundations of modern influencer culture can be traced directly back to this era. Because today, artists are expected to maintain this highly curated visual identity across social media platforms, but MTV was one of the first systems to industrialize that idea on a massive scale. And what's fascinating is how normal this feels to us today. It's almost impossible to imagine mainstream music without the visuals attached to it. We expect artists to have aesthetics, branding, choreography, and visuals, just this instantly recognizable imagery that's so important for their brand. But that expectation was heavily shaped by MTV, and it influenced who people wanted to become. And part of this is also that MTV changed the economics of music. Suddenly, success wasn't just about songwriting or radio play. It was about whether you could compete visually. Video budgets, label investments, styling, choreography, and production value all started to matter in a new way. This is where music videos begin to shift from purely creative expression into these really high-stakes marketing tools. The music wasn't just being released, it was being packaged for visual impact. And as certain artists raised the bar, it created a kind of visual arms race where everyone had to escalate production to stay competitive. And Michael Jackson sits right at the center of this shift because projects like Thriller didn't just redefine what a music video could be creatively, but they also just reset expectations for scale, ambition, and investment across the entire industry, which is pretty amazing. But I do want to touch on this because alongside all of this innovation, glamour, and cultural influence, there was also a much more uncomfortable question sitting underneath the rise of MTV. Who actually got to be seen? Because if MTV had become one of the most powerful cultural gatekeepers in the world, then the people deciding what appeared on screen had enormous influence over whose identities, aesthetics, and stories were considered worthy of visibility. Now, in its early years, MTV faced major criticisms for its lack of Black artists. The channel's programming heavily favored white rock acts, and although executives often framed this as a rock format, critics pointed out that it effectively excluded large parts of Black musical culture, despite its undeniable dominance at that time across pop, R&B, funk, and just emerging crossover genres. And this matters far beyond programming decisions. Representation is never just about entertainment. It actively shapes perception, aspiration, and cultural value. When certain groups are repeatedly centered in media, they become associated with these ideas of success, desirability, talent, and legitimacy. Over time, this repetition builds what media theorists like Gerbner described in cultivation theory, the idea that long-term exposure to media doesn't just reflect reality, but it subtly constructs it. So if a platform as influential as MTV repeatedly amplifies some identities while excluding others, it doesn't just affect popularity. It shapes who is perceived as culturally central in the first place and who's positioned at the margins. And this is why the emergence of Michael Jackson becomes such a defining cultural moment, and what inspired this episode, actually. Now, while it's important to say that Black artists did appear on MTV before him, they were not consistently supported or placed in heavy rotation. But that changed dramatically in 1983 with the release of Billie Jean. Its music video became the first by a Black artist to be added into the heavy rotation on MTV, marking a structural shift in how the channel operated. But this shift didn't just happen passively or just purely based on artistic merit. See, it was also shaped by intense industry pressure. So Walter Yeknikoff, the president of CBS Records, reportedly threatened to pull all CBS artists from MTV's platform. This is a scene that's shown in the Michael movie. Pretty iconic, including some of the biggest white rock acts of all time, if the network continued to refuse sustained airtime for Jackson's work. And, well, it was a success. That pressure forced MTV into a position where it could no longer justify its existing programming choices without risking these major commercial consequences. So, once Billie Jean entered heavy rotation, something shifted quite quickly. The video didn't just appear occasionally, it became constant. It basically became part of the visual language of MTV itself. And then came Thriller, which didn't just continue this momentum, but expanded it into something even more culturally dominant. The Thriller music video transformed what a music video could be. Not just a promotional clip, but a cinematic, choreographed, narrative-driven cultural event. It blurred the boundaries between music, film, performance, and storytelling, just setting this entirely new expectation for scale and ambition in visual music culture. And at that point, Michael Jackson wasn't just participating in MTV, he was reshaping its identity and forcing it to evolve. With Billie Jean, the more that MTV rotated the video, the more it moved from being just an addition to actually becoming part of the cultural norm. And it also demonstrated something important about media power. Once a visual format becomes globally standard, it raises the ceiling of what all other artists are expected to produce, influencing budgets, creativity, and even industry competition in a way that just raises the stakes of visual music. And following this breakthrough in general, MTV's landscape began to shift more visibly. Artists like Prince, Tina Turner, and Donna Summer started receiving significantly more exposure, signaling this broader, albeit gradual, opening of the channel's representation. But what's important here is not just the inclusion itself, but what it reveals about how visibility actually works in media systems. Access to screen time wasn't neutral. It was shaped by commercial pressure, cultural gatekeeping, industry negotiation, and audience demand, all layered on top of each other. It was so complex and really messed up. And this brings us to the deeper kind of psychological layer of the story. Michael Jackson's visibility on MTV wasn't only about breaking a barrier in a television network. It was about breaking into a system that defines cultural importance through repetition and exposure. Once you're repeatedly seen, you become normalized within cultural imagination. You become part of what people think of as mainstream. And once that happens, it reshapes aspirational identity, not just for one audience group, but globally. Because what was really at stake here wasn't just which songs got played, it was which identities were allowed to occupy space in the collective imagination of pop culture. MTV, perhaps more than anything before it, made that mechanism visible. And once you see that clearly, I think the question really becomes unavoidable. Who gets to be seen, and how does that visibility determine who gets to feel culturally important in the first place? It's a really interesting question that had me thinking, and like I said, inspired this episode overall. Now, I want to finish today's episode with the core of all of this. The reason that all of today's episode matters is because it isn't just cultural history, it's psychological architecture. Once music became visual through MTV, it didn't just change what we saw, it changed how our brains processed, stored, and emotionally interpreted music itself. And there's actually a growing body of research in music psychology and cognitive neuroscience that shows that visuals don't just accompany music, they actively reshape it. Now, one of the most consistent findings in this area relates to memory encoding. Studies in audiovisual perception suggest that when sound is paired with strong visual stimuli, the brain binds those two impacts together into this kind of single, unified memory trace. But in simple terms, so we don't just remember the song, we remember the scene, the lighting, the movement, the expression, and just the world that the song existed in. This is why so many people don't mentally recall early MTV era songs as pure audio. Instead, they remember fragments of music videos. And the music has just become so autobiographically encoded with the visuals, meaning that it gets stored as part of a lived experience rather than just sound. And this effect becomes even more powerful when you consider repetition over time. Music videos weren't just one-off exposures, they were played repeatedly on rotation. From a cognitive perspective, repetition strengthens consolidation in long-term memory, especially when emotion is involved. So the more that MTV circulated a video, the more deeply it embedded itself, not just in cultural memory, but in personal memory structures. That's part of why certain songs from that era feel almost inseparable from their visuals. The brain has literally fused them together over repeated exposure. But this connects to broader findings in cognitive psychology and multimodal memory as well. So when multiple sensory channels are activated at once, in this case, hearing and vision, memory becomes stronger, more emotionally charged, and more durable over time. And that's part of why music videos can feel so nostalgic even decades later. You're not just remembering a track, you're reactivating a full sensory snapshot of a moment in time. And importantly, this also explains why nostalgia for music videos can feel so intense. You're not just recalling that single kind of stimulus, you're reconstructing an entire sensory environment, which is really fascinating. And then there's emotional interpretation, which arguably is even more powerful. So there are a number of studies that show that visual context can significantly alter how we interpret the emotional tone of the same piece of music. So in some controlled experiments, participants often rate the same song as happier, more sad, or more intense, or even romantic, depending on the accompanying visuals. So, in other words, the music itself doesn't fully determine the emotional meaning. The brain integrates visual cues to construct that meaning. And this is where elements like color, narrative, symbolism, and just cinematography really become psychologically important rather than just aesthetic. Color grading can make a song feel warmer, colder, more nostalgic, or more aggressive, even. And narrative structure can shift a track from abstract emotion into something concrete and story-driven. Symbolism can layer additional meaning onto lyrics that might otherwise be interpreted differently. And cinematography, so the camera movement, framing, pacing, can really shape physiological responses like arousal and attention, just subtly guiding how intensely we feel about the music. Even editing rhythm plays a role here. Faster cuts can increase, perceived intensity, while slower pacing can deepen emotional immersion. It must be so fascinating to work in this industry and just be behind the scenes on all of this. There's really so much that goes into it that we don't really think about in our day-to-day lives, but there really is so much. So what MTV effectively did was introduce a second interpretive layer onto music. It wasn't just what does this song sound like anymore. It became what does this song look like, and therefore what does it mean? And once that second layer exists, it starts influencing even future listening experiences. People often report that hearing a song without its video feels incomplete. And that's really interesting because it shows that the visual layer has become part of the core memory structure, not just an accessory. And because of that, music videos also changed attachment. Now, I spoke of this a little bit earlier, but there is evidence in media psychology that repeated exposure to combined audiovisual content strengthens emotional bonding to media figures. So when you consistently see an artist performing, expressing emotion, or just inhabiting a visual world, your brain builds this stronger familiarity with them. It's definitely stronger than audio alone. And this is closely tied to parasocial relationship formation that I mentioned previously, the one-sided psychological bonds that people form with media figures. Importantly, this isn't about illusion or fantasy, but more about how the brain uses repetition and familiarity as shortcuts for that kind of social cognition. Familiar faces become easier to process, easier to trust, and easier to feel emotionally close to, even without real-life interaction. So before MTV, in what you could call the radio era, artists were relatively distant, right? You might know their voice, maybe a photograph, maybe an interview, but the emotional distance was much larger. The imagination filled in most of the gaps, and that created a kind of mystery, but also separation. Music existed more, like I said, as this internal experience shaped by imagination and your own kind of emotional projection. But then in the MTV era, that distance collapsed. Artists became visually accessible. And that repetition creates this element of familiarity, which drives perceived intimacy. But now, in the modern era, I think this process has evolved even further. With platforms like TikTok and YouTube, the boundary between artist and audience has become even more porous. We no longer only see highly produced music videos, we also see behind the scenes clips, live streams, personal content, informal performances, just fragments of these people's lives. And this intensifies parasocial connection even further, but in a kind of different way. It's less cinematic, it's more constant and fragmented, and to be honest, more psychologically immediate, I guess. The relationship is no longer built only through iconic visual narratives, but through this kind of continuous micro exposures. I mean, it's really just crazy to think about how at one point we didn't see artists at all, and then we suddenly had access to their creative expression. And now we've kind of got access to whatever they want us to see, which is usually quite a lot. I mean, some artists still maintain parts of the mystery, but it's crazy how much things change. But if you zoom out across time, you can really trace this very clear shift in how music functions psychologically. At every stage, it's about how we as human beings construct meaning from sound when vision is introduced into the equation. So when we bring all of this together, what becomes clear is that MTV wasn't just a moment in music history. It was a turning point in how humans experience music itself. And even though MTV as a dominant cultural force has declined, visual music culture has never disappeared. It simply evolved into different forms. So what started with MTV shifted into platforms like YouTube and then into the short form world of TikTok. And across each and every stage, the same pattern continues. Music becomes increasingly visual, fragmented, and increasingly tied to how it's seen as much as how it's heard. Today, artists are still actively making music videos, thank God, because I love a music video and they still remain a core part of how music is released, experienced, and remembered. YouTube, in particular, is still one of the biggest on-demand platforms for music consumption, where full music videos coexist alongside all of these different formats, like live performances, visualizers, and user-generated clips as well. In many ways, it's become the long-term home of the MTV legacy, just without the kind of scheduling. Everything is always available, always replayable and searchable. And the scale of this visual music culture is almost hard to comprehend. So, one fun fact: the most watched music video on YouTube, apart from Baby Shark, is Despacito by Louis Fonsi and Daddy Yankee, with over 9 billion views, which is absolutely crazy. But beyond records and numbers, what matters more is the direction that things continue to move in. Songs are often now designed with visuals in mind from the outset. Hooks are built for clips, choruses are built for choreography, and moments are engineered for virality. We don't just discover music through listening anymore. We often discover it through seeing it first, whether that's in movement, in trends, or just in these short visual fragments that carry emotional meaning before we even hear the full track. And this really matters because it changes how quickly we form emotional attachments and how we remember songs, how we experience them. Music is becoming less of a linear listening experience and more of a visual emotional snapshot culture. But I think the deeper point from all of this is that MTV didn't kill radio. It didn't replace music. What it did was permanently alter the human experience of music by adding this visual layer that the brain can never fully separate again. Once music became something that we could see, it stopped being purely abstract. It became identity, image, memory, and experience. And that's the legacy that still shapes every song that we hear today. So, visual media doesn't just accompany culture, it really just decides what culture looks like. And I think that's pretty phenomenal in itself. This was such an interesting episode to research. I learned a lot in the process of this. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music and music videos as much as you do, or may just find it interesting. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Also, come and say hi over on Instagram and on Threads. Let me know what are some of your favorite music videos of all time. I would love to start a discussion over there. Always love to hear from you guys. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on the Sound Mind.